She built her bed inside the chimney wall, not beside it, not near it, inside it. And she did it alone in the summer of 1872, 6 months before the coldest winter in 30 years came down from Canada and tried to kill everything in the St. Croix Valley that was not ready for it. Most things were not ready. She was. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the cold came, before the thermometers failed and the cattle froze, standing up and grown men wept into their coat sleeves. At 3 in the morning, there was a woman standing beside two graves under a lone bur oak at the eastern edge of a cornfield, holding a shovel, watching the March sun come up pale and thin over the Wisconsin hills. One grave was her husband's, the other was smaller. Their daughter, born too early and too quiet, had never needed a name. Margaret Caldwell stood there for a long time. She did not cry. She was 43 years old. She had crossed an ocean. She had buried a child before this. And she had learned somewhere in the years between Norway and Wisconsin that grief does not wait for permission to arrive, but it can be made to wait before it is answered. She planted the shovel in the soft March ground and walked back into the house. 3 weeks passed. She did not speak a word to anyone that the valley could remember hearing. She planted the spring corn in straight rows. She milked the two cows before dawn and again at dusk. She carried water from the well 1/2 mile away twice each day with a wooden yoke across her shoulders and two oak buckets hanging from it, and she did not spill a drop because spilling was wasteful and waste was something Thomas had always said they could not afford. And she intended to keep believing the things Thomas had said for as long as they kept being true. She did not go to Edmund Pierce's general store. She did not attend services at the small white Lutheran church 2 miles down the wagon road. She fed the 7 chickens and repaired the section of fence the late winter had pushed over and split the wood that Thomas had left in rounds beside the barn, and she did it all without speaking to anyone, because there was no one to speak to, and because speaking would have made the silence inside the house louder by contrast. What no one in the valley knew was what she did each evening after she extinguished the oil lamp. She sat at the trestle table in the dark, and she unfolded 3 sheets of paper from the inner lining of the leather travel trunk that had come with her from Norway in 1869. The papers were covered in her father's handwriting, small and careful in Old Norsk, and they described things she had grown up knowing and had not thought about since. Her father had been a stonemason in Telemark. Not an ordinary stonemason, a builder of Pasmer houses, the old kind, where the central chimney mass was not a flue for smoke, but a thermal engine for survival, designed to absorb the heat of the day's fire and release it slowly through the night, long after the flames had died, keeping the household alive in temperatures that would otherwise not be survivable. The old houses had a sinja cove built into the flank of that chimney mass, a sleeping cupboard, a wooden chamber set directly against the warm stone, sealed from the cold room beyond by insulated walls where the youngest children and the oldest grandparents slept on the worst nights of January and February. Margaret had slept in one herself. She had been 7 years old and her mother had just died, and her father had carried her to her grandmother's house in the first week of the new year, and her grandmother had put her inside the Singa Cove with a feather tick in a wool blanket and closed the door. The stone wall behind her had been warm, not hot, warm, the way a person's hand is warm when they press it against your back to tell you everything will be all right. She had lain there in the dark for a long time before she slept, and she had thought that the stone itself was trying to say something to her, something patient and old, something that the cold outside could not touch. She had not thought about that warmth in 30 years. Not until Thomas died and she found herself reading her father's papers in the dark and remembering what the world felt like when something was holding you against the cold. On the second Monday of May, Margaret Caldwell walked into Edmund Pierce's general store for the first time since the funeral. She was wearing clean dark wool, and her hair was pinned correctly, and she carried a list written in her careful schoolhouse hand. Pierce was 71 years old and had known Thomas well and had wept openly at the graveside, and he looked at her over his spectacles with the kind of careful gentleness that a man learns when he has lost enough people himself to understand that grief is not something you speak to directly. She placed the list on the counter. Pierce read it, then he read it again. 20 pounds of fire clay mortar, 3 pounds of mason's lime, 1 6-pound mason's hammer. He looked up at her. He asked with as much delicacy as a Norwegian-American shopkeeper of 71 could manage whether she was planning to build something. She told him she was planning to rebuild her chimney. He pointed out gently that her chimney had been built only 2 summers ago by Thomas himself, that it drew properly, shed water correctly, and showed no signs of structural failure. She agreed that all of that was true. Then she counted out her coins onto the counter and picked up her bag and walked out without adding anything further. She did not see Daniel Cooper standing near the window or Virginia Hartwell at the far end of the dry goods shelf, but they were there. Daniel Cooper was 22 years old and had finished building his own cabin the previous autumn and had not stopped talking about it since. He had taught himself carpentry from 2 books and the observation of other men's work, and he carried the certainty of a young man who has done one hard thing well, and concluded from this that he understands hard things in general. He looked at the list Pierce had set back on the counter after Margaret left, and he said loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear that he wondered what on earth a widow needed with fire clay mortar and a mason's hammer. It sounded to him, he said, like someone was planning to cast cannonballs. Virginia Hartwell did not laugh. Virginia Hartwell was perhaps 45, the wife of George Hartwell, who owned the largest and best-built farm in the valley, and she had a way of asking questions that made them sound like expressions of concern when they were, in fact, instruments of measurement. She turned from the dry goods shelf without quite looking at Margaret's empty space by the door and asked Pierce in a mild and pleasant voice whether Mrs. Caldwell was managing all right up there on the hill all alone like that, with no one to look after things. Pierce said he believed she was managing fine. Virginia said she only asked because it must be so difficult. For a woman alone. She folded her dry goods under her arm and left. Margaret was halfway up the hill road when she stopped. She set the bag of materials down on the ground beside the ruts left by the last wagon, and she sat down on a stone at the side of the road, and she looked up at the chimney of her cabin outlined against the pale May sky. Thomas had built that chimney. She could see the particular way he had fitted the cornerstones, a slight overlap on the eastern face that was his habit and no one else's. She had watched him do it and had thought at the time that it was a perfectly adequate chimney, which it was, and that it would serve them well for many years, which it would have if he had been there to see those years. And then, without quite deciding to, she began to cry. Not the way she had cried in the first days after Thomas died, which had been violent and private and had left her hollowed out. This was quieter. It was the crying of someone who has been holding something at a distance and has let it get slightly too close. She cried for perhaps 4 minutes, and then she wiped her face with her apron and picked up the bag and continued up the hill. She did not cry again for a very long time. The 3rd week of May, she built a scaffold from 2 sawhorses and 3 borrowed planks and began taking the chimney apart. She worked from the outside, removing each stone in sequence, and as she removed each one, she laid it on a canvas sheet and in the pattern it had occupied in the wall, so that she could read the structure of what Thomas had built and understand how to improve upon it without losing what was sound. It was a methodical approach, the kind her father had taught her, the kind that treats a structure as a document to be understood before it is revised. Three women from the valley came up the hill on a Sunday afternoon to see what she was doing. They found her on the scaffold with a mason's hammer and a cold chisel working at a mortar joint with the concentration of someone who was listening to the stone as much as striking it. They asked why she was taking apart a perfectly good chimney. She wiped the mortar dust from her cheekbone with the back of her wrist and told them the chimney was going to do more work than it had been doing, and that more work required a different shape. They left. They told their husbands. The husbands shook their heads. What Margaret was building, and what no one in the valley had words for, was something her father had described across those 3 sheets of paper with the precision of a man who had spent his life getting cold things warm. She was going to expand the chimney mast by 16 inches on its south face, creating a thick shoulder of solid stone running from the cook stove up through the ceiling. Inside that shoulder, she would install what her father called a smoke channel, a baffled passage that forced the hot exhaust gases to travel a longer, winding route through the masonry before reaching the open flue. Every foot of that extra journey deposited heat into the stone rather than sending it up into the Wisconsin sky. And inside that expanded mass, hollowed out and lined with smooth pine boards, would be the Singa Cove. 3 feet wide, 6.5 feet long, 4 feet from floor to ceiling. The rear wall of the alcove would be the chimney stone itself, radiating heat slowly and steadily, hours after the last log had turned to ash. The front wall would be 2 layers of tongue and groove pine with 2 inches of dried sphagnum moss packed between them, because dry sphagnum moss traps still air the way a bird's down traps it, and still air does not steal heat the way moving air does. Her father had explained the principle once when she was a girl. Stone, he said, has memory. It takes heat slowly and releases it slowly. Wood is quick and forgetful. You build your house out of what is quick because it is easy to work with. But you sleep against what remembers because on the night when everything else is forgotten, the stone is still giving back what you gave it hours ago. She had a model she had built on the trestle table from kindling and rolled birch bark, and she tested its smoke channel by lighting a plug of pine resin inside it and watching the way the smoke moved. When the smoke moved the way her father's notes said it should, flowing through the turns and deposits in the right sequence, she committed the design to actual stone. The smoke channel was the most delicate part. If the baffled dimensions were wrong, the chimney would smoke back into the room. If the proportions were off in a different way, it would fail to draft at all on still nights. And on still nights, the cook stove produced carbon monoxide along with its heat. And carbon monoxide has no smell and no color, and kills sleeping people as gently as a hand drawing a curtain. She got the dimensions right. She knew she had gotten them right because the model told her so, and because her father had gotten them right in 6 different houses over 40 years in Telemark, and had written down what he knew with the care of a man who understood that knowledge dies with its keeper unless it is written down for someone to find. She was the someone who had found it. Edmund Pierce came up the hill in June the first time with a basket containing cold ham and dark bread and a stone jug of small beer. He sat across from her at the trestle table while she ate, which she did with the focused efficiency of someone who had been working outdoors since before sunrise. And he looked at the canvas covered in patterned stones and at the scaffold and at the growing block of new masonry on the south face of the rebuilt chimney. He asked whether she was comfortable working alone up here. She said she was comfortable. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question he had actually come to ask. He asked whether Thomas had known she could do something like this. She set down her bread. She was quiet for longer than he expected before she answered. Thomas knew who her father was, she said. He had never thought of that as strange. Pierce nodded slowly. He picked up his small beer and drank from it and looked out the window at the partially rebuilt chimney. He had known Thomas Caldwell for 3 years well enough to have heard the man speak with unmistakable pride about his wife's family in Telemark, about a father who built houses that had stood for 100 years on the sides of mountains that would have defeated most men. Pierce had not thought much of it at the time, the way you do not think much of things until the moment arrives when they matter. He was thinking of it now. He finished his beer. He set the remaining food on the table and told her he would come back. She told him he would be welcome any time. It was the first meal she had eaten with another person present since the funeral. July arrived and brought Daniel Cooper with it. He came up the hill on a Tuesday morning without being invited, which was consistent with his general approach to most situations. He stood at the base of the scaffold and looked at the new chimney mass, which had grown from its original 2-foot square profile into something substantially wider and more asymmetrical. A broad stone shoulder leaning out over the south wall of the cabin, like something that had decided to stay. He looked at it for a while. Then he said that a chimney with that cross-section would draft poorly. Larger interior volume meant lower pressure differential, which meant weaker draw. He said this as a statement of established fact, which to him it was. Margaret did not look up from the mortar joint she was working. She said the section that had been enlarged was solid stone. There was no interior volume in the new portion, nothing to draft through. He asked why it was enlarged then, if not for draft. She set down the trowel and looked at him. It was the first time she had looked directly at him, and he found the steadiness of it slightly uncomfortable in a way he did not fully understand. She said stone remembers heat. Wood does not. The question of how much stone you need to remember enough heat to carry you through a January night is the reason it is that wide. He did not entirely follow the logic, which was a new experience for Daniel Cooper, and not a welcome one. But there was something in the way she said it, without impatience, without any apparent need for him to understand or agree, that made arguing feel beside the point. He went back down the hill. That afternoon at Pierce's store, he told 5 men that the widow Caldwell was building something that was going to kill her by spring. Carbon monoxide from the cook stove would seep through the stone and fill the sealed alcove while she slept, and she would be found in the morning looking peaceful and already gone. He said it with the confidence of a young man who has never been badly wrong about anything yet, which is a very particular and dangerous kind of confidence. No one in the group contradicted him. Contradicting Daniel Cooper meant defending Margaret Caldwell, and defending Margaret Caldwell had become in the course of a single summer an uncomfortable position to occupy in public. Pierce was behind the counter and heard all of it. He said nothing, but that evening after the store was empty, he sat in his chair behind the counter and thought about Thomas Caldwell's voice saying a father who built houses that have stood for 100 years. He thought about the canvas covered in stones laid out in sequence. He thought about a woman who built a smoke channel test model from kindling before she trusted it with actual stone. He was still thinking about it when he locked up for the night. August came and Margaret built the wooden chamber inside the hollowed stone. She used clear pine from Bergstrom's water-powered sawmill, 3 valleys to the east, and she fitted each board with tongue and groove joints tight enough that a straw would not pass between them. The floor was raised 8 inches above the cabin floor, the space beneath packed with planer shavings and dry oak leaves to break the cold that rose from the boards below. The ceiling was 4 feet above the alcove floor, low enough that you could not stand high enough to sit upright against pillows and read by the light of an oil lamp. The front wall was the most precise surface she built. 2 layers of pine 3/4 inch each, with a 2-inch cavity packed tight with sphagnum moss she had harvested from the bog at the foot of the hill, and cured on drying racks in the loft for 6 weeks until it was crisp as old paper. She stuffed it in handfuls, tamping it with a wooden dowel to a density light enough to hold still air and firm enough not to settle over the years. At the base, she left a hairline gap screened with fine mesh so that any moisture could wick out rather than rot the wood from inside. At the top, she tacked a strip of muslin to keep the moss from drifting downward over decades. The door was hung with 3 wrought iron hinges forged in trade for 2 hens and a clutch of eggs. Its inner face was padded with a thick wool quilt sewn from worn blankets. A wooden peg latch operated from inside by a quarter turn held it closed against the slight pressure of warm air the alcove would develop on cold nights. There was no window. The only opening was a small adjustable vent slot in the upper corner of the door, which she could open to admit fresh air from the main room or close to seal the alcove entirely. By the second week of October, the masonry was cured and the woodwork was complete and the moss was packed and the door was hung, and on a cool evening she built a small fire in the cook stove and let it burn for 4 hours. Then she carried her oil lamp into the alcove and closed the door. The rear wall, the stone was warm against her shoulder. Not hot, not uncomfortable. Warm the way a bank stove is warm an hour after you have stopped feeding it, the way a good stone retains something of the afternoon sun even after the sun is gone. She read her father's 3 pages one more time, every line from the first notation about thermal mass to the last measurement of smoke channel depth. She read them as she had read them every evening for 6 months, but for the first time she was reading them from inside the thing they described. She blew out the lamp. She slept until dawn. When she opened her eyes, the stone behind her was still warm. The cook stove had been cold for 9 hours. She lay still for a while with one hand resting flat against the stone. She said something quietly in Norwegian to no one, to the stone, to the dark. She said father was right about everything. Then she lay there a moment longer and felt something she had not expected, which was grief. Not the crushing early grief of March, but something quieter and more specific, the recognition that Thomas was not here to see this, and that he would have stood in this alcove with his hand on the stone and understood immediately. And that understanding would have been his, the particular light that comes into a man's face when something works the way it was supposed to work. And she would never see that expression on his face for this or for anything else because he was under the bur oak at the edge of the cornfield. She let herself feel that for a moment. Then she stood up and went to cook her oats. The following Sunday, she put on her clean, dark wool and walked the 2 miles down the wagon road to the White Lutheran Church the first time since the funeral, and she sat in her old pew and listened to Reverend Arthur Hale preach from Proverbs. The wise woman builds her house. Whether the Reverend had chosen that passage with her in mind, or whether it was the work of coincidence or providence, she never afterward determined. In the churchyard after the service, with the maple leaves turning and the air carrying the first true cold of autumn, she stood among the women of the valley for the first time in 7 months. She felt the silence shift around her, become specific and intentional, the way silence does when it is organized. Virginia Hartwell asked how she was managing on the hill. Margaret said she was managing well and had finished the work on the cabin in time for winter. Virginia asked what work. Margaret said she had built a sleeping cupboard inside the chimney wall. Virginia asked clearly and in plain English whether she was saying she now slept inside her fireplace. Margaret said yes, that was approximately correct. Virginia did not laugh. Virginia Hartwell was a Lutheran and a respectable woman, and one did not laugh aloud in the churchyard. But the corners of her mouth tightened in a way that communicated everything laughter would have communicated, and perhaps more because it was calculated rather than spontaneous. Around them, the other women registered it and took their positions accordingly. The name arrived within the week. The chimney woman. It was not meant kindly, and everyone who used it knew it was not meant kindly, and they used it anyway because the alternative was to take seriously what she had done, and taking it seriously would have required understanding it, and understanding it was not something anyone had yet been willing to try. Back at Pierce's store, Daniel Cooper gave his verdict before a small audience of men one afternoon in late October. The widow Caldwell had built her own death. He said it with the calm certainty of a man who considers himself to have thought the matter through. The older men who knew better said nothing. Saying something would have meant standing up for her. Standing up for her had a cost. Pierce listened from behind the counter and said nothing either. But that night he sat alone in a small room at the back of the store, and he remembered clearly and without effort what it had felt like to put his hand against the walls of his grandmother's house as a boy in Norway the summer his family left. The walls of that house had been warm in a way that walls in America had not been warm since. He had forgotten it so completely that the memory arriving now felt almost like someone else's. He sat with it for a long time before he went to bed. Through the last days of October and into November, Margaret kept her notebook. Each morning at 6 and each evening at 9, she read 3 thermometers. One on a nail outside the north window in shadow away from any reflected heat. One on the wall of the main room, 4 feet from the cook's stove. One on the inside of the alcove door at the height of her head when she lay on the feather tick. The last week of October, with nighttime lows at 15 above zero, the main room held 52 degrees with a banked fire. The alcove held 68. The third week of November, when an early cold snap drove the overnights to 12 below zero, the main room fell to 39. The alcove held 64. She wrote those numbers in her careful hand and looked at them in the lamplight each morning and felt something that was not triumph and was not vindication, but was something quieter and steadier than either the feeling of a long calculation that is beginning to come out even. Outside on the hill road, the occasional wagon slowed as it passed. The occupants looked up at the expanded chimney, now wide and asymmetrical against the sky, a stone shoulder that had not been there in September. They spoke to each other about it. Some of them used the name. Margaret heard it. The valley was small. She heard the name and she heard the joke about her cremation, which had originated with George Hartwell and been polished by several retellings. And she heard Daniel Cooper's verdict quoted back to her in 3 different versions, each slightly more elaborated than the last. She continued to attend church. She continued to nod to Virginia Hartwell in the aisle. She bought her flour and her coffee and her lamp oil from Pierce and conducted her business and walked out. When the women at the store fell silent at her entrance, she said good morning to Pierce and completed her purchase and left without lingering. She had nothing to prove to any of them. The stone was keeping her records. And on the coldest morning of November 12 below, outside the alcove at 64 degrees, she wrote the numbers in the notebook and turned to a fresh page and wrote the name of the next month. And outside the window, the first real snow of the season was coming down through the dark pines on the north slope of the hill, soft and unhurrying as if it had all the time in the world, which it turned out it did. The storm arrived the way the worst things do, without announcement, without the theater of wind or the warning of clouds building on the horizon. It simply arrived in the second week of December as a pressure and a darkness and a cold that settled into the valley like something that intended to stay. By the first morning, the thermometer nailed to the post outside Pierce's store read 8 degrees above zero. By the second morning, it read 9 below. And by the third morning, when the snow had been falling for 40 hours straight, and the drifts had buried the lower fence rails, and the wind was driving hard out of the northwest at a sustained 35 miles an hour, it read 21 below. And the men who came into Pierce's store stamping ice from their boots did not talk about it the way men talk about ordinary weather. They talked about it the way men talk about something that is trying to win. In the Whitmore cabin, half a mile east of the wagon road, Henry Whitmore had burned through his entire week's supply of split wood by the end of the second night. He was a blacksmith, a methodical and unsentimental man who had spent his life working with heat and knew its value precisely, and he stood in front of his dwindling wood pile on the morning of the third day and made the calculation without flinching. He went to the woodshed and began splitting green oak in the lee of the building in wind that cut through his coat as though the coat were paper. The green wood smoked more than it burned. The fire it made was sullen and reluctant. But it was fire, and in 21 below zero, sullen fire is better than none. Mabel Whitmore sat inside near the stove with their son William, who was 2 years old, and had a chest that seemed to attract cold air the way a lamp attracts moths. She held him close and watched her husband's shadow move past the frosted window and said nothing because there was nothing to say, because Henry was already doing everything there was to do. Across the valley in the largest and best constructed farmhouse in the St. Croix watershed, George Hartwell had both his stoves and the parlor fireplace burning simultaneously and was telling anyone who would listen that the Hartwell house had never failed in a winter yet and was not about to start. His wife Virginia sat in the parlor with the 3 children arranged near the heat and did not contradict him. Virginia Hartwell had the intelligence to understand situations that her pride would not yet allow her to name. And in Daniel Cooper's cabin, which he had built with his own hands the previous autumn, in which he had spent considerable energy describing to other men as a sound and well-considered piece of construction, the wind was finding gaps he had not known existed. Not large gaps, not the kind you could see, the kind that announce themselves only when the temperature outside is cold enough to make a single degree of difference. He sat up late feeding the stove and listening to the wind work its way through his walls and told himself it was fine. The stove was hot. The room was warm enough. It was fine. On the hill, Margaret Caldwell banked her cook stove at 9 o'clock as she had done every night since October, and went into the alcove and closed the door. In the morning, she opened her notebook. Outside, -21, main room 41 degrees, alcove 67 degrees. She wrote the numbers and turned to the next page and began the entry for the following day. The blizzard broke on the 4th morning. The valley emerged into a stillness that was not peaceful but merely exhausted the way a battlefield goes quiet after the last exchange. The snow was chest deep in the wagon ruts. The sky was the color of old pewter. Pierce found that 4 jars of preserves on the lowest shelf of his back room had frozen solid. He was 71 years old and had wintered in Wisconsin for 40 of those years, and he had not had preserves freeze in his back room before. He noted this without alarm because at 71 you learn to note things without alarm. And then he moved the remaining jars to a higher shelf and built his fire up and went about his business. But a week later, when the sky had cleared and the temperature had briefly climbed back toward the single digits above zero, he put on his felted boots and his heaviest coat and his wool fur hat and walked up the hill road to Margaret Caldwell's cabin because he had been thinking about something since the blizzard, and he had decided it needed to be seen rather than imagined. She let him in. He stood in the main room and looked at the south face of the chimney at the door set into the masonry, and he asked if he could look inside. She held the door open. He bent and looked in at the feather tick, the oil lamp on the corner shelf, the copper pot of water that showed not a film of ice on its surface. He asked quietly if he might sit inside for a few minutes. She stood back and let him climb in. She did not follow. She stood in the main room, which was 44 degrees with a fire going, and waited. Pierce sat inside the alcove with the door mostly closed for perhaps 8 minutes. When he climbed out, he stood with one hand resting on the warm pine of the doorframe and was quiet for long enough that Margaret had time to wonder what he was thinking. He said it in Norwegian slowly because he had not used the language in many years and wanted to be sure she understood him completely. He said, "This is how my mother's mother slept. I had forgotten." He did not stay much longer after that. He drank the coffee she poured and asked a few careful questions about the depth of the masonry and the composition of the front wall insulation, and then he thanked her and went back down the hill. That evening, George Hartwell came into the store for a sack of flour and made a remark in the easy way of a man who considers the subject closed about the chimney woman on the hill and her funeral box. He said it with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he is being amusing. Pierce looked at him from behind the counter without expression. Then he said in a voice that did not invite response that Mrs. Caldwell had built something he had not seen since his childhood, that her construction was sound in every particular, and that he did not want to hear her name used that way in his store again. George Hartwell was a large and self-assured man who had been trading at Pierce's counter for 23 years and had never heard Edmund Pierce speak in that register before. He took his flour and left without the additional comment he had been forming. The story of that exchange was in every kitchen in the valley by the following afternoon. The open mockery of Margaret Caldwell quieted. The private kind did not stop, but it moved indoors, which was at least an acknowledgement that it needed to hide. Then came January. The 8th of January, 1873 arrived as a clear and cloudless morning, with a thin high overcast and a north wind that moved without gusting steadily and purposefully the way wind moves when it is not showing off but working. The thermometer at Pierce's store read 14 below at sunrise. Margaret noted it in her notebook and went out to break the ice on the cow's water trough. By the evening of the 9th, the thermometer read 26 below, and the wind had died entirely, which was worse. People who have lived through serious cold know this wind is honest about what it costs you, but still air at deep minus temperatures is deceptive. It feels almost gentle. There is no chill factor to announce itself. There is only the cold going in deeper and deeper, as patient and certain as water finding its level. By the morning of the 10th, the thermometer at Pierce's store read 38 below zero. Frost had grown 3 inches thick on the inside of the store's front window, not on the outside where frost belongs, but on the inside, which told you everything you needed to know about what the glass itself had become. Pierce had stopped trying to heat the front of the building and had retreated to his small back room with his oil supply and his blankets and his Norwegian Bible, which he had not opened in a decade, but which he held now with both hands for reasons that had nothing to do with reading. What had descended on the St. Croix Valley was a mass of Arctic air, the size of half a continent, that had detached from its usual circulation above Canada and slid south and parked itself over the upper Midwest with a stability that felt permanent. There was no storm. There was no drama. There was only the temperature dropping day by day with the mechanical indifference of a thing that does not know it is killing anything. The cabins in the valley began to fail. In the Whitmore cabin, Mabel had been watching William's breathing for 3 nights. He was sleeping near the stove on a pallet that Henry had moved as close to the heat as safety allowed, and on the night of the 10th, the stove burned low at 1 in the morning, while Henry slept and did not come back up to temperature for nearly 2 hours. During those 2 hours, the room dropped. Mabel did not know by how much. She only knew that when she woke at 3 and pressed her palm against the boy's cheek, his skin had the wrong quality to it, a kind of cellular exhaustion that a mother's hand recognizes before her mind catches up. By the morning of the 11th, William had a fever and a cough that rattled in his chest like pebbles in a tin can. Mabel sat with him in front of the rebuilt fire and Henry stood in the doorway between the bedroom and the main room, and they looked at each other across the sick child and the failing warmth and the 38 below temperature outside and did not speak for a moment because the situation was already speaking for them. Henry said, "I am going up the hill." Mabel nodded and did not say anything because there was nothing to add. What Henry Whitmore did not say and what he thought about on every step of the mile-long walk up the hill road in the pre-dawn dark of the 11th was that he had been in Pierce's store the previous October when Daniel Cooper made his pronouncement about carbon monoxide and sealed alcoves and widows found peaceful and dead in the morning. And he had said nothing. He had stood there with four other men and said nothing, not because he believed Daniel Cooper was right, not exactly, but because it was not his dispute, and the woman on the hill was not someone he had spent time defending before, and starting now seemed complicated. He had said nothing. He walked through the dark in minus 38 degrees with his son's fever in his mind, and the weight of that silence on him like a fifth layer of clothing heavy and not keeping him warm. He knocked on her door at 11 o'clock at night. Margaret opened it. She had been reading by the oil lamp in the main room, which was 18 degrees despite the fire, and she was wearing her wool coat over her nightclothes, which tells you something about what 18 degrees feels like when you are sitting still. Henry Whitmore stood in the doorway with the cold coming off him in waves. He said two words. He said, "My boy." She stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." She opened the alcove and told him to take William inside. Henry carried the boy through the low door and sat on the feather tick with his back against the stone and the child against his chest. The alcove was 68 degrees. William, who had been shivering in his blankets in a room that had dropped to single digits, went still almost immediately. The way a child's body goes still when it finally stops fighting the cold because the cold has gone somewhere else. Margaret closed the alcove door. She sat alone in the main room at 18 degrees for the rest of the night, wrapped in her wool coat and her lap blanket, reading when she could see well enough by the low fire, and not reading when she could not. And she got up at midnight and again at 4 in the morning to add 2 lengths of oak to the stove each time, as quiet as she could manage. And each time she went back to her chair and pulled the blanket up and sat in the cold that the rest of the valley was drowning in. And she did not think of it as sacrifice because it had not occurred to her to calculate it that way. In the morning, Henry brought William out of the alcove. The boy was still feverish, but his breathing had loosened and his color had come back to something closer to what it should be. Henry stood in the main room holding his son and looked at Margaret and tried to find something to say that was large enough for what the night had been and could not find it. She told him to sit down and handed him a cup of coffee and put bread on the table. They did not speak much. But before he left, Henry said the thing he had come to the hill to say, or part of it, that he had been in the store when Daniel Cooper talked, and that he had not said anything and that he should have. He said it looking at the table, not at her, the way men say the things they are not practiced at saying. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Drink your coffee." He did. 2 nights later, on the evening of the 11th into the 12th, Daniel Cooper made his own accounting with the cold. His cabin had 1 bedroom separated from the main room by a single partition of half-inch pine boards with no insulation between them, which he had built in the autumn when it was warm, and which he had at the time considered more than adequate. At 40 below, it was adequate the way a paper hat is adequate in a rainstorm. His wife Dorcas was 20 years old and 7 months pregnant, and she woke at 2 in the morning shivering in a way that was not controllable. The deep muscular shivering that happens when the body has decided that the extremities are expendable and is pulling everything it has toward the core. 3 quilts and a buffalo robe, and she was shivering hard enough that Daniel felt it from his side of the bed and was awake in an instant. He carried her into the main room and put her back to the wall beside the stove and held her with his body and fed the fire with one arm over her shoulder, and he stayed there until the shivering slowed and then stopped and her breathing evened out. It took most of the night. At 5 in the morning, he made a decision. He saddled the horse in the dark in 41 below zero, working fast because he knew better than to work slowly at that temperature. And he got Dorcas up on the horse and led it the mile and a half south to his parents' farm, where there was a larger stove and more bodies in a bedroom on the ground floor with a chimney running along the interior wall. He got her there. She was all right. The baby was all right. He turned around and walked the mile and a half back alone. By the time he reached his own cabin and got the door open and got inside, both of his ears had gone through the red stage and the white stage and were now the color and texture of old candle wax. He knew what that meant. He had grown up in Wisconsin. He knew exactly what that meant and what it was going to cost him. He stood in front of his stove and held his ears in his bare hands and waited for the pain to arrive, which it did in the way that frostbite pain always arrives, not immediately, but with a delay, as though the cold wants to be well away before the bill comes due. He did not cry. He was 22 and had said things he should not have said and done things he should not have done, and the cold had simply collected on the account in the most direct way available to it. He sat down on the floor in front of the stove and breathed and waited for the pain to peak and begin to subside. He did not think about Margaret Caldwell's alcove at that moment, but the thought would come later in the days that followed, when he could not put on a hat without wincing, and it would come in the specific and unavoidable way that important realizations tend to arrive quietly, completely, and too late to change what had already happened. On the hill in the alcove on the morning of the 11th, Margaret wrote in her notebook, outside 42 below, main room 19 above, alcove 69 degrees. On the morning of the 12th, outside 43 below, main room 18 above, alcove 71 degrees. She had stopped letting the stove burn down entirely through the night. At this depth of cold, she had established a rhythm. Sleep-wake at midnight, open the alcove door, cross the 8 feet of main room floor, open the stove, add 2 lengths of seasoned oak, adjust the damper to a slow burn, close everything, return to the alcove. The whole operation took less than 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, the alcove temperature dropped by perhaps 2 degrees. Within 20 minutes of closing the door, it had recovered. 3 minutes of cold to purchase 8 more hours of warmth. On the night of the 12th into the 13th at 3 in the morning, she was crossing the main room floor in the dark, moving from the alcove to the stove by memory and feel, when she noticed something through the north-facing window. A light, low and orange, moving at the level of a man carrying a lantern, coming up the hill road from the direction of the valley. She stood at the window and watched it until she was certain of what she was seeing. Then she went and put more wood in the stove and turned the damper wide open and put the coffee pot on. The knock came 20 minutes later. It was Henry Whitmore again, alone this time, and he was not carrying William. His face, what she could see of it above the coat collar and below the hat brim, was the color of old chalk. He had walked a mile in 43 below zero for the second time in 3 days. He said, "My neighbor to the south, Old Man Gustafson, his fire went out, and he does not have enough wood to rebuild it. He is 74, and he is alone." Margaret was already pulling her wool coat off the hook. What followed was the part of that night that no one in the valley ever fully heard about, because neither Margaret Caldwell nor Henry Whitmore were people who narrated their own actions. They walked south together in the dark, carrying the lantern and a load of split oak from her woodpile, and they got the old man's fire going and stayed until the room had come up to a temperature that would not kill him by morning, And they stacked the remaining wood where he could reach it, and then they walked back up the hill in the dark, and Henry turned south toward his own cabin, and Margaret went inside and noted the time in her notebook and went back to the alcove. She wrote nothing extra about that night in the notebook. The entry for the morning of the 13th read, as it always read, the three temperatures, the condition of the animals, the weather as observed. But below the temperatures in handwriting, slightly smaller than her usual hand, as though she had decided to add it and then reconsidered and added it anyway, she wrote a single line in Norwegian. It said, "Today I do not feel alone. The cold held. Day after day it held. The 13th, the 14th, the 15th. Outside, things continued to fail in the systematic way that things fail when the margin has been used up and there is nothing left to draw on." The Hartwell farmhouse, the largest and best built in the valley, did not fail in the dramatic way that smaller cabins failed. But on the night of the 12th into the 13th, when the outside temperature fell to 43 below, even the Hartwell house could not maintain a livable temperature in the upstairs bedrooms. The thermal gradient between the heated first floor and the uninsulated upper rooms was simply too steep, and no amount of additional wood changed that, because George Hartwell's house had been built to be comfortable in ordinary Wisconsin winters, and an ordinary Wisconsin winter was not what this was. Virginia Hartwell did not make a scene. She was not a woman who made scenes. She organized the children onto pallets in front of the kitchen stove, ranged them by tea and warmth requirement, placed the heaviest quilts over the smallest children, and then lay down herself beside her husband on the hard kitchen floor, with her cheek against a folded coat that served as a pillow. George had not spoken much since the middle of the second night of the cold. He was a man who was accustomed to situations he could manage, and this was not one of those situations, and he did not know what to do with the difference. He lay on his back in the kitchen and stared at the ceiling and listened to the fire and the wind finding its way through the north-facing walls, and tried to think of something useful. At 3 in the morning, he got up to add wood to the stove. He stood in the kitchen with the orange light of the open stove door on his face, and he looked at his wife and 3 children arranged on the floor, and he looked out the north window, not toward anything in particular, just out into the dark. After a while, he realized he could see a point of light up on the hill, an orange flicker behind frosted glass. He stood and watched it for a long time. He did not say anything. He closed the stove door and went back to his place on the floor and lay down and did not sleep. Virginia was awake beside him. She had been awake for most of the night, watching the ceiling, thinking thoughts she did not share. She knew about the alcove. She had heard every account of it, including the ones she had helped to circulate. She had stood in the churchyard and tightened the corners of her mouth and watched the words spread outward from that gesture like rings from a stone in water. And she had done it deliberately and without particular regret, because she had believed at the time that she understood the situation. She was not certain now what she had believed, or whether it still seemed as clear as it had in October. The kitchen floor was hard under her hip. The fire was 6 feet away and she could still see her breath. Her youngest was coughing in his sleep. She did not say anything to George, but she lay there with the thought that she had been wrong about something and the particular nature of what she had been wrong about. And she let those thoughts have the night because there was nothing else to do with them. And the floor was hard and the fire was not enough, and outside it was 43 below. On the morning of January 13th, the worst morning of the entire cold spell, Margaret Caldwell opened her notebook and wrote her numbers. Outside, 45 degrees below zero. Main room, 16 degrees above zero. Alcove, 70 degrees. She sat with those numbers for a moment. 115 degrees of difference between where she slept and where the cold lived. Separated by stone and pine and moss and the accumulated knowledge of people who had figured this out centuries before anyone in this valley had been born. She wrote the temperatures. She wrote that the animals were fine. She wrote that the coffee was good. Then she added the line about not feeling alone in Norwegian in smaller letters below everything else. She folded the notebook and set it on the shelf. Outside, the cold sat on the valley and waited. It had been waiting for 9 days, and it was prepared to wait longer. It would simply continue to be what it was for as long as conditions permitted, and everything that was not prepared for it would eventually show the cold how unprepared it had been. Margaret Caldwell had been prepared for it since May. She went out to feed the chickens. The cold broke on the morning of January 17th. There was no dramatic announcement, no crack of thunder, no shift of wind that announced itself. It simply changed the way very large things change gradually and then all at once. A man stepping out of the Bjornstad cabin to check his wood supply noticed that the air entering his lungs no longer felt like breathing ground glass. He stood there for a moment, not quite believing it, and then he looked south and saw the clouds coming up from that direction, low and gray and full of moisture. The kind of clouds that belonged to a different and more livable world than the one the valley had been inhabiting for 9 days. By noon, the thermometer at Pierce's store read 19 below. People looked at that number and felt something close to relief, which tells you everything about what the previous 9 days had done to the available range of human feeling in the St. Croix Valley. The valley came out of its doors and took stock. William Whitmore was alive. His fever had broken on the 14th, 3 days after Henry's night walk up the hill, but the cough had settled deeper into the boy's chest, and Mabel had already sent Henry to the river settlement for the doctor before the cold broke. The doctor came on the 18th, listened with his instrument, prescribed a mustard poultice and warm steam in time, and said the boy was young and his lungs were otherwise sound, and that young lungs have a way of coming back from things that older ones cannot. Mabel held that sentence for several days before she allowed herself to fully believe it. Dorcas Cooper had come through the cold without harm. The baby had come through without harm. Daniel himself had lost the full sensation in his left ear and partial sensation in the right, and the outer edges of both ears had gone through a progression of colors over the following week that was unpleasant to observe and more unpleasant to experience. He would not lose the cartilage, but the scarring would be permanent, visible whenever he was hatless, which in a Wisconsin winter meant visible to the people who knew him well enough to see him indoors. That turned out to be enough people for the story to get around. Edmund Pierce had lost 22 pounds of butter to freezing in his cellar, which represented a meaningful portion of his winter margin. He was alive, and his fingers and toes were all present and accounted for, and he counted himself fortunate in the particular way that men count themselves fortunate when they have had 9 days to think carefully about what fortunate means. The Hartwell cattle losses were 3 head found stiff in the far end of the barn on the morning of the 14th. George Hartwell recorded the loss in his ledger without comment and replaced the animals in the spring and did not discuss the cold publicly in any terms that suggested it had found him unprepared, because George Hartwell was not a man who discussed such things. Reverend Arthur Hale had ridden circuit between his 3 congregations in the first days of January before the temperature had reached its lowest point, but after it had already reached the level where exposed skin becomes a liability. His nose had gone white on the 3rd day of riding, and by the time he reached his own hearth, it was too late for the tip of it. The blackening came over the following week, and then the sloughing, and when he stood at his pulpit on the first Sunday after the cold broke, the congregation saw a man whose face bore permanent and visible evidence of having tried to serve his people in conditions that were not survivable by ordinary measures. Nobody mentioned it, everyone saw it, It became part of who Arthur Hale was for the rest of his ministry, which continued for another 19 years. Margaret Caldwell walked into Pierce's store on the morning of the 18th carrying a basket of eggs. The eggs had not frozen on the 2-mile walk down from the hill. Her hands had not gone numb inside her mittens. She pushed through the door into the store and found Pierce behind his counter in his wool coat and 2 pairs of socks, with a coffee pot on the small stove in the corner. And he looked up when the bell above the door rang, and then he stood up, and that was when she saw his face. He had been genuinely uncertain through the longest of those 9 nights whether she was still alive up there. He had told himself otherwise. He had believed otherwise mostly, but certainty is a resource that deep cold depletes along with everything else, and there had been hours in the dark when Edmund Pierce, who was a rational and unsentimental man, had not been entirely sure. He told her he had not worried for a single moment. He said he had known all along she would be fine. She set the egg basket on the counter and looked at him. She said she was sorry to have worried him. He said she had not worried him in the slightest. They looked at each other for a moment across the counter. She bought her flour and her coffee and her lamp oil and paid in coin, and she was turning for the door when Pierce said her name quietly, and she stopped. He said, "I want you to know that the things that were said in this store in the fall will not be repeated here again." I should have said that sooner. I am saying it now. She stood with her hand on the door frame and looked at him. Then she said, "You came up the hill twice with food in June when I had not eaten properly in weeks, Edmund. You have been saying it all along." She went out into the cold, bright morning and started up the hill. There were 3 people who watched her go from 3 different positions along the road, none of whom she was aware of. George Hartwell was standing beside his freight sled outside the feed merchant, having just concluded a transaction he had delayed until the roads were passable. Daniel Cooper was sitting in the window of the small eating house across from Pierce's store, his ears still wrapped in linen, drinking something hot. And Virginia Hartwell, who had come into town with George for the first time since the cold began, was standing outside the dry goods shop with a list in her hand, and she had stopped moving when Margaret came out of Pierce's door, and she stood still until Margaret had turned the corner of the road and was no longer visible. None of the 3 spoke. None of them needed to. The woman had walked 2 miles in the aftermath of the coldest 9 days in 30 years to bring an old man a basket of eggs, and the eggs had not frozen. And that said something that none of them had the right vocabulary for yet, but all of them understood in the way you understand things that are demonstrated rather than argued. Henry Whitmore came back up the hill 3 days later alone. Mabel was home with William, who was improving steadily. Henry stood at the door of the cabin, and when Margaret opened it, he came inside and sat down without being asked, which was different from his previous visits in a way that was hard to name but easy to feel. He was not asking for something this time. He was not delivering an apology exactly, though what he said contained one. He was simply there in the way that people are sometimes simply there when they want to acknowledge that something has changed between them. He asked her to teach him to build what she had built. Not the full Pismer, he understood that the existing chimney mass in his cabin was not large enough for the complete design, but the adapted version, the wooden alcove built against the outer face of the chimney stone with insulated walls and a sealed door. She told him what the adaptation required: a floor elevated 8 inches off the main cabin floor, double walls with cavity insulation, a door that sealed at every edge, a small adjustable vent. She told him it would not hold temperature as steadily through the long hours as the full design, but that it would still create a small enclosed volume where the radiant warmth of the chimney stone could accumulate, and where a child's body heat would make a measurable difference, and where the difference between survivable and not would be held more reliably than in an open room. She drew the dimensions on the back of an envelope, the floor elevation, the wall construction, the door ceiling. She drew it the way her father would have drawn it, with the measurements noted at each joint and the materials listed in the margin. Henry took the envelope and folded it into his coat pocket with the care of someone handling a document of some value, which it was. He said before he left, "I am going to build this right. I am going to build it so that William grows up knowing what it is and why it is there." She said she thought that was a good idea. He went down the hill. He came back the following week with his brother-in-law, who was a carpenter, and they spent 4 days building the adapted alcove against the south face of the Whitmore chimney, using rough sawn pine and dried meadowgrass packed between the walls in place of moss, because the bog at the foot of Margaret's Hill was the only reliable source of sphagnum in the valley, and it was frozen solid. The meadowgrass was not as effective, but it was adequate, and Henry knew the difference between perfect and adequate and understood which one the situation called for. William slept in the alcove for the first time on a night in late January when the temperature outside was 11 below. Mabel reported that he slept for 9 hours without coughing once. Mabel came up the hill 2 days after that with William on her hip, and she sat at Margaret's trestle table and held the boy when he squirmed, and when he settled, she put him down on the floor with a wooden spoon to occupy him, and she looked at Margaret across the table. She said, "I owe you an apology for the fall, for the things I did not say when I should have said them. I was in the store more than once when things were said that were not fair, and I did not speak up, and I have thought about that more than I would like to admit." Margaret looked at her for a moment and then looked at William on the floor, who was studying the wooden spoon with the concentrated seriousness of a 2-year-old encountering a new object. She said, "He looks better." Mabel said, "He is better. He is much better." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then Margaret said, "The apology is accepted, Mabel, and the next time you are in the store and something unfair is being said about someone, you will know what to do. That is worth more than the apology." Mabel nodded. She picked up her coffee with both hands and held it and did not say anything more about it, because there was nothing more to say that would improve on what had already been said. Daniel Cooper came up the hill on a Thursday at the end of January. He came alone, and he came without announcement, and he came in the particular posture of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before he can change his mind. His ears were still visibly healing, the linen wrapping replaced now by bare skin that was pinkish and tight-looking, in a way that would soften over time but never entirely disappear. Margaret opened the door and looked at him. He said, "I told people you were going to die in that alcove. I said it like I knew what I was talking about. I said it loud enough that people repeated it and some of them believed it, and that made things harder for you than they needed to be. I was wrong about the construction, and I was wrong to say it the way I said it." He stopped. He did not offer an explanation for why he had been wrong or a defense of the reasoning that had led him there. He simply stated the fact of it, which is the only version of an apology that carries weight. Margaret studied him for a moment. She was not a woman who made people work for forgiveness longer than the situation required, because she had grown up in a tradition that considered excessive withholding its own kind of vanity. She opened the door wider and said, "Come in." He sat at the table. She set a cup in front of him. He looked around the cabin at the chimney mast at the alcove door set into the south face of the stone, and she could see him looking at it the way a carpenter looks at something, reading the joinery and the proportions and the decisions that had been made at each stage. He asked if he could see the smoke channel drawings, not the alcove itself, the channel, the part that lived inside the masonry. She put the 3 pages on the table. He read them slowly, and she translated where he needed translation, and after a while it became less like explaining and more like two people who understand the same language of joints and loads and materials working through a problem together, which turned out to be a language they both spoke better than the other kind. He asked whether he could copy the drawings. She gave him a fresh sheet of paper and a pencil and let him copy what he needed. He worked carefully, his handwriting smaller and more precise than you would expect from hands that size. And when he was done, he folded the paper and put it in his pocket and thanked her. He built his own alcove in 12 days, working alone, except for one afternoon when his brother came to help hang the door. He did not use meadow grass. He walked to the bog at the foot of Margaret's Hill, which had thawed enough by mid-February to allow harvesting, and he cut sphagnum and brought it back on a sledge and dried it in his loft and packed it himself. The alcove he built was not identical to Margaret's. He had his own ideas about the floor elevation and the door construction, and a few of those ideas were improvements on the original. He did not tell anyone about the improvements, but he did not tear them out and do it the standard way either, because he was 22 and still enough of himself to trust his own judgment when he believed it. Dorcas slept in the alcove for the last 2 months of her pregnancy and said it was the first time she had slept through a full night since October. Their daughter was born in March healthy, and they named her after Dorcas's grandmother, and neither of them mentioned Margaret Caldwell when they explained the name to people, but neither of them had forgotten the warmth in which that child had spent her last months before arriving in the world. Virginia Hartwell never came to the Hill. This was not a surprise to Margaret, and it was not after the first week or two a source of particular feeling. Virginia was who she was, and she had done what she had done, and the cold had done what it does to all positions held on insufficient grounds, which is to renegotiate them on its own terms. The renegotiation in Virginia's case was internal and private and left no visible record, which was entirely consistent with how Virginia Hartwell conducted the rest of her life. What Virginia did in the summer of 1873 was arrange for a delivery of pine lumber from Bergstrom's sawmill. George told the neighbors it was material for a storage closet off the kitchen. Everyone in the valley understood that this was not accurate. No one said so because the situation had passed, the point where saying so served any purpose, and there were other things to think about. The alcove that resulted was well built. George hired competent carpenters and the work was done correctly. Virginia slept in it the following winter and said nothing about it to anyone. But in the winter of 1875, when a family new to the valley asked her about the best way to stay warm in a cabin with a chimney already in place, she described the alcove method in complete and accurate detail with the confidence of someone who knows a thing from personal experience rather than hearsay. She did not mention Margaret Caldwell's name. Margaret heard this eventually through the small valley circulation of information that she had long since stopped trying to resist. She sat with it for a moment and then put it in the same place she put most things that could not be changed, behind her, not underneath her. Her father had told her once that knowledge does not belong to the person who holds it. It belongs to the use it is put to. Virginia Hartwell had put it to use. A family new to the valley would be warm the following winter. That was the point. That had always been the point. In the spring of 1875, a correspondent from the Decorah Poston came to interview her. He sat across the trestle table with his notebook open and his pencil ready and asked her to describe her innovation. She stopped him there. She said it was not an innovation, it was a recovery. Her grandmother had slept this way. Her grandmother's mother before her. The people of the coldest places on earth had understood this relationship for as long as there had been people in cold places, and the idea had crossed every ocean it had ever needed to cross in the minds of the people who carried it, and it had arrived in Wisconsin inside a leather trunk that also contained her wedding clothes and 3 books and a photograph of her parents. The correspondent asked what she wanted him to write. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "Write that it is something people forgot." and that forgetting things that keep you alive has consequences, and that the consequences arrived in January of 1873, and the valley took note. He asked at the end of their long afternoon whether she had any regret about the way the year had gone. She was quiet for long enough that he looked up from his notebook. She said, "I regret that Thomas did not see it. He would have liked the numbers in the notebook. He appreciated a calculation that came out even." The correspondent wrote that down and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her and did not ask anything further because there was nothing further that needed asking. Margaret Caldwell remarried in 1878 to a Swedish carpenter named Arthur Berglund, a quiet and capable man who laughed at the right moments and built things with his hands the way she built them, with attention to what the material was actually doing rather than what you hoped it would do. She found a private amusement in the fact that she had married a second man whose name began with A, and she kept that amusement to herself because some things are funnier when they are kept. Arthur built a second alcove on the north face of the chimney for guests in the first winter of their marriage. He built it without being asked, having looked at the south alcove and understood what it was and what it was for, and having concluded that the north face of the chimney mass had been wasted all this time. They did not have children, but they raised Margaret's niece Winifred from the age of 9 after Winifred's parents died of typhoid in the summer of 1880, and Winifred grew up in that cabin on the hill knowing exactly what the two doors set into the chimney wall were and why they were there and what had been required to build them. When she was old enough to ask, Margaret told her the full story. The summer of building, the summer of mockery, the 9 days of cold, the notebook. Winifred listened to all of it and asked her questions and listened to the answers, which was exactly the right response, and which is why Margaret told her the whole thing rather than the simplified version. Winifred married a man from the river settlement in 1893 and built her own house and put 2 alcoves in it, one for each child she eventually had, and her children grew up warm and grew up knowing why. The cabin on the hill stood for another 75 years after Margaret Caldwell finished building it. When it was donated to the County Historical Society in 1947 by Winifred's daughter, the society sent 2 men up to assess its condition, and they reported back that the masonry of the chimney was as sound as anything they had seen, that the smoke channel was intact and functioning, and that the alcove door opened and closed on its original hinges without complaint. The sphagnum moss in the front wall had been replaced twice, once in the 1890s and once in the 1920s, and the pine boards had been refinished, but the stone was the stone that Margaret had laid in the summer of 1872, and it had not moved. The cabin is open to visitors in the summer months. There is a small interpretive sign beside the alcove that explains thermal mass and the Norwegian Pesmer tradition. There is a plaque beside the sign with words from Margaret's notebook in her careful schoolhouse hand. The words say, "Stone remembers, wood forgets, build with what remembers." The notebook itself is in the archives of the Historical Society in a flat archival box with acid-free paper between its pages. The leather cover has dried and cracked at the corners. The ink has faded to brown, the particular brown of very old iron gall, which was the standard writing ink of 1872, and which survives in documents much longer than the people who used it. The entry for the morning of January 13th, 1873, "The coldest morning of the coldest winter in 30 years," reads in full. Outside -45, main room +16, alcove +70, slept 7 hours, coffee good, cows fine. And below those words, in smaller writing, added as though it were an afterthought, and meaning more than an afterthought today, "I do not feel alone." She had built her bed inside the chimney wall because her grandmother had built her bed inside the chimney wall. She had built it because her father's notes had told her how, And because the memory of warm stone against a 7-year-old girl's back was a memory that did not fade even across an ocean, even across 30 years, even across the particular silence of a house where someone you loved used to be and is no longer. She had built it through 6 months of loneliness and 3 months of mockery and 9 days of cold that tested everything in the valley and found most things wanting. She had built it with a mason's hammer and a borrowed scaffold, and the knowledge that belonged to people who had solved this problem before she was born, people who had understood that the question of how to stay warm through a killing winter is not a question about how much wood you can cut. It is a question about what you build and what you build it to remember. The valley had answered that question one way with large rooms and high ceilings and wood piles that looked adequate in October and were not adequate in January. She had answered it another way. On the morning of January 18th, when the cold had finally broken and the air smelled for the first time in 9 days like something other than cold, she walked the 2 miles down to the wagon road with a basket of eggs and found Edmund Pierce alive behind his counter and told him she was sorry to have worried him and let him tell her he had not worried at all and smiled at him when he said it. She bought her flour and her coffee and her lamp oil and walked back up the hill in the cold January sun, which was low and pale and throwing long shadows across the snow, and the shadows were blue and precise, and the air had the quality it gets after extreme cold lifts, a clarity that makes everything look slightly more itself than usual. She put her purchases on the shelf. She stoked the cook stove and put the coffee pot back on. She went into the alcove and sat on the feather tick in the warmth that the stone had been holding since the night before, patient and unwavering. And she sat there without reading and without the lamp, just sitting in the dark warmth with her back straight and her hands in her lap, the way you sit when you are done with a thing and you know it is done. Thomas would have liked the numbers. He would have stood in this alcove with his hand flat on the stone and known immediately what it meant, and the knowing would have been in his face, that specific expression of a man whose understanding is structural rather than decorative, who sees the load path and the material behavior and the margin of safety all at once, and nods because there is nothing to say that the thing itself has not already said. She had built it for survival. She had ended up building it for other things too, for the memory of her grandmother, for her father's handwriting on 3 folded sheets of paper, for the 7-year-old girl who had been cold and lost and had found in the warmth of a stone wall the first indication that the world was not entirely indifferent to her existence. For that girl, and for the woman that girl had become, and for all the people in the valley and beyond the valley who would sleep warmer in the years ahead because of what that woman had built in the long summer when her husband was newly in the ground and her neighbors were shaking their heads and the stone was waiting patient, as stone always is for someone who understood what it was for. She sat in the dark warmth for a long time. Then she heard one of the cows shifting in the barn and remembered she had not yet put down the afternoon feed, and she stood up and ducked through the low door and crossed the main room and put on her coat and went outside into the cold, bright world to do what needed to be done. The stone held the warmth she had left it. It would still be holding it when she came back.